Hello and welcome to FinTech Scotland's podcast and to the second episode of our special series on financial crime, brought to you in collaboration with our strategic partner, BT. Today, we're focusing on a critical and evolving threat in the world of fraud and financial services specifically, and this threat is messaging fraud. So in our first episode, we explored the broader landscape of financial fraud in the UK. And this time, Charlotte from BT will take the reins once more and interview two fantastic guests, Kevin Britt, Product Manager for Messaging at BT, and Paul Maskall, Strategic Fraud Prevention and Behavioural Lead Principal at UK Finance. And together, they look into why messaging fraud is on the rise, why people are still vulnerable to these scams despite growing awareness, and what measures are being developed to outsmart fraudsters. This episode comes at a very exciting time for FinTech Scotland, as we've kicked off an innovation call on financial crime, part of the Financial Regulation Innovation Lab in Glasgow, with challenges set by leading financial institutions such as Morgan Stanley, Aberdeen, HSBC, Lloyds Banking Group, TSB, Virgin Money, Barclays, and Dudley Building Society. So we've seen quite a lot of applications from all around the world, with companies coming forward to try to solve those issues. It's a perfect example of how partnership, collaboration, and fresh thinking can drive solutions in this space. So stay tuned for a fascinating discussion and insights that will help you and your organization navigate this complex landscape. And now it's time to pass over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Very delighted to be hosting the second episode in the series. Like you say, great response and feedback from the first one. So here we are with two super exciting guests. We've obviously got representation from BT again, like you said, and we've also excitingly joined by UK Finance, who are also a key partner that we work with across the industry, which Kevin and Paul will no doubt come on to discuss shortly. So as Mikhail mentioned, today's episode is centred around messaging fraud. So we're using this as a term which covers both smishing, which is obviously a type of phishing fraud. And for those listening, this is a type of fraud that happens specifically through texts, where scammers will impersonate organisations or family members to attempt to steal your personal information or money, which is often done by sending links designed to download malware to your device. Interestingly, this is really currently the most popular form of scam targeted at students, and that's something that we may explore as well during the episodes. So joining us today, Mikhail's already given our intros, but what I would like you to do now, Kevin and Paul, please, would be to introduce yourself, the organisation that you're part of, and how smishing specifically impacts your role. Kevin, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. So hi, everyone. My name's Kevin Britt. So I'm a product owner at BT. So my primary focus is to how do we maintain trust in an SMS? So when a customer receives a text message, they know it's from the business that they believe it to arrive from. So my role as that product manager is to how do we use technology, our BT technology stack, to protect customers and improve that trust.
Thanks, Kevin. And Paul, over to you.
Brilliant. Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name's Paul Maskall. I'm as Mikhail kind of quite right, frankly, kind of gave me the introduction beforehand. But yeah, I'm the Strategic Fraud Prevention and Behavioural Lead at UK Finance. It's a bit of a mouthful. There's a lot of words to the title. But I'm also a bit of an identity crisis because I'm not just UK Finance, but I'm also part funded by City of London Police, which is the kind of the national lead force from the fraud and cybercrime perspective as well. So, but my role is a very, very different one because I'm much more of a flowery social scientist than I am probably anything else. So I look and concentrate much more on the behavioural science around how is it that humans are generally much more vulnerable to online manipulation. And I look at intuition, I look at the aspects around what's called cognitive heuristics, so the mental shortcuts in which human beings utilise. Spoiler alert, we're terrible at it, but the idea, and I have no idea how humans got this far, but it's very often applying this into the quality of the education in which we deliver, how education lands. We can talk about awareness as we all we like, but actually in reality, I can go have the best education in the world, but can I motivate you to go and do it? And that's really the key element of actually motivating people to realise that it is in fact a problem to be motivated to protect yourself against. And that's the real issue, is that generally speaking, people don't care. unless you've been a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll explain, and I'll kind of give a little bit more of a detail in that respect as we go along as well.
I'm really excited to hear things from your perspective, Paul, because I think the behavioural science lens is one that's maybe, from my perspective in BT, it's not actually been explored. So I'm really interested to learn more.
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, Kevin, why do you feel that we're seeing such an increase in messaging fraud? How does it reflect within BT, and what do you feel is the impact for many of your customers and consumers?
Yeah, so text messaging is a really effective communication medium, right? So if you was to go onto your phone and look in your messages app, actually you don't have many communications with friends and family in the messaging app anymore. If you actually look down, probably 80% is communication with a business. What we've found is that actually what I call P2P, person-to-person messaging is now happening in WhatsApp, it's happening in Facebook Messenger, it's not happening in your native inbox. So what fraudsters have the capability to do is get a message in front of the user really effectively, and people trust SMS. They go into the inbox, they read the messages, and there's always tends to be calls to action. So a call to action in a text message is kind of a default thing. You don't just receive a message to say, hi, it's hi, can you do this? Can you click on this link because we're going to give you a discount? Can you click on this link because we've seen kind of activity happening on your account? So it's quite easy to get that message into the inbox, and my role is like, how do we make it harder? Because at the minute there's not enough steps in the communication channel to prevent that happening. So if something's easy and effective, a fraudster is going to use it because it's the least passive resistance.
Yeah, that does make sense, and I completely agree. I feel like for me personally, I tend to use WhatsApp far more than I do SMS nowadays. And obviously, you've said, how do you find that that's impacting customers in BT? Are you getting more organisations coming to BT and looking for support on how to combat this?
So this started really during COVID. So smishing happened pre-COVID, but actually fraudsters identified that when people were expecting their test results via from COVID-19, it was always there, and people kind of used this kind of scare tactic at the time of, you've contracted COVID or you've been close to someone, to kind of collect these details. So we've then seen that kind of progress through. We then had that delivery notification boom that happened because all of a sudden people had money to spend, but they couldn't go to the shops. So like, this is the most effective way to trick somebody. And from someone that's in industry, actually, I almost became a victim to this, right? Because I was expecting a parcel from one of the big parcel delivery companies, and I was out the house. I knew it was going to be within this window, and they were just very lucky that they sent it when I was expecting it. And I went to click on the link, and then all of a sudden it was like, you need to pay £1.49. I was like, that doesn't ring true with me. Like, I should know better than this. But lots of people don't, right? And that's the problem. And it can be quite hard to educate the wider communication base. I mean, if you look at banks, they do lots of great stuff. Like the government's doing lots of great stuff. Like, you can constantly see, if you receive a smishing message, forward it to 7726. Like Apple now has a one-click reporting facility in there. So there are all of these education pieces, but it's still an effective method, right? And business fraudsters are evolving constantly. So when we started to do lots of blocking in banking, they then moved to kind of the mum and dad fraud. And this is a really important thing for us to get on top of, because I think, like we said before, Charlotte, like, our customers are the banking customers, our customers are the parcel delivery customers, right? So it's a joint problem that we need to kind of get on top of.
Yeah.
And also to highlight on that one as well, because again, from 2020, obviously we did have smishing campaigns beforehand and things like that. But when I was working in the DCPCU, or the Dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit, so it's a funded unit that works on behalf of the financial industry and directly services the financial industry. And interestingly enough, a lot of the law enforcement sort of aspects, especially during COVID, is like, okay, well, we can't necessarily go out. But what we found is that we became sort of the smishing police during that time, because it was so prevalent. But the fact is, it was interesting because we also not just saw the kind of the digitization and the kind of digitally enabled elements of the victim of the individual, and being much more reliant on tech, much more emotionally volatile. There was a lot of uncertainty in those sorts of situations. So the last bastion of people that hadn't necessarily adopted technology had just gone into this process and had to rely on it just because of the circumstances. but also criminals had to diversify just as much as we did. Because again, they're not necessarily going to work, going out there, etc., because everybody's at home or all sorts of contexts. So what we found was that, especially with smishing and messaging fraud and a number of other elements of fraud, went absolutely skyrocketing. But one big thing what we found was how accessible it was. So out of the 40 or so individuals that we arrested during the kind of the initial kind of COVID pandemic, especially for large-scale national smishing campaigns, out of that 40-something, only 2 of which were over 18. So the fact that actually messaging fraud and smishing and what we've seen with the kind of accessibility, things like SIM farms back then, we've had a lot of legislative changes in this space, but it's reflecting not just the changing nature of the criminality on that side and how accessible it is, because it's much easier for me to commit a crime, commit fraud in my underpants in my bedroom, as opposed to putting myself at risk by shoplifting or doing another traditional crime. So it highlights this big change that we've seen across the board, not just from a victimology point of view, but also a criminology point of view as well.
Yeah, and I think to really kind of key to highlight, like this is a UK crime, so a lot of fraud, to my knowledge, can be international. Actually, if you look at the people perpetrating this, there's a very specific MO, right, of who's doing this, and they are UK criminals. So actually, during COVID, BT actually forged really good relationships with DCPCU, right, which have continued since then, and you can constantly see DCPCU are constantly catching smishers. And we're very much more aware of Telegram and the dark web and identifying smish kits. So like BT is kind of very much on the forefront of this, of saying, well, how do we stop this at source? Because we can apply lots of technology but we're not capturing the people that are doing this, right? And actually, across DCPCU and BT and other networks, there's a huge data pile there to actually identify these people and take them out of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think, Kevin, it reiterates, I know this will be a common theme that we get throughout this series being centred around fraud, is that really this cross-industry collaboration is key, isn't it? And knowledge sharing, that information communication really does help us to kind of work as a unit to prevent and block the fraudsters making changes and moving forward together. Now, I'm really interested, obviously, Kevin, you mentioned that even you yourself were nearly a victim of smishing fraud, despite obviously significant work in this space. And Paul, you've given a lot of further thought to this in terms of it's quite straightforward these days, or it's more common for youngsters as such to be involved. The opportunity is far easier. But I'm quite interested to learn is, from the science side of it, why, despite, we obviously know the dangers, well, we think we do, there's lots of training in the workplace and outside of that accessibly online, we are aware of what these dangers are and the risk that comes with it, but why as humans are we still falling victim to this?
So there's probably, how long is your podcast? But it's very often trying to highlight that actually there is a number of different factors, not just behavioural point of view, how we make decisions and all these sorts of things, and also how society has changed and how we consume content, for instance. So for instance, first of all, on the basis of risk. Now, for the last probably 10 or so years, I've done a lot of work around how humans assess risk. So I'd come from intelligence and I went into counterterrorism and a brief time in there before I went into cyber and fraud. I was like, you know what, this is really my career. This is really my passion. Not committing it, by the way, but just more the preventing it side. But it's very often the case of where I'm going out to businesses and organizations and trying to do exactly that, is to raise education. I was working with the likes of BT at Astral Park. I was working with universities. I was working in the East of England. And going out to businesses, very often it's the case of going, look, this is a real issue in which you need to be aware of, but actually people don't care. And actually for the majority of the population, people don't care about it, and especially when it comes to cyber and fraud. And what this did for me was it started this kind of long rabbit hole of trying to understand why is it that people don't necessarily assess the risk. So the example, and again, for most of you who have probably heard my content before, is that very often I sound a bit of a stuck record, because if I say air travel, for instance, well, actually a lot of people are scared of getting in a plane. It's one of the top 10 phobias, and generally speaking is that in comparison, like the old adage is, it's much more likely you die horribly on the way to the airport than ever up in the air. But you don't get to the airport and go, oh, thank God that dangerous part of my journey is over. Let's get on a nice, safe plane. That's not how we function. But the thing is, you have, in this sort of situation, you have a very emotional, visual, and visceral sense of what can happen to you going at several hundred miles an hour in a steel or aluminium tube. You don't get that, and when do you, with a car crash, because when is it that you associate the risk with a car crash? Once you've just been involved in one. Because very often a pile-up at the M25 does not make a particularly good, interesting Fast and the Furious film or a news story, but an air crash does. Does it make a particularly interesting story that you see on YouTube or see on content? So you don't necessarily, you're not exposed to the risk in the same way. So the fact is that the statistics, although it's much more prominent that you will be a victim of a car crash over and above an air crash, that does not change your fear. I can say it as much as I like. But when I say terrorism, for instance, everybody has an image in their head that represents the problem to them, quite viscerally and quite visually. Much more likely to get struck by lightning, depending on where you are in the world. But what if I say fraud? The problem is with this, there is no image that comes to mind. So when I say fraud and scams and cyber, and even things like disinformation, radicalization, online grooming, very often the case is that because most of it's online enabled, you don't have an image that represents the threat and the risk.
Yeah. So
the problem is with this is that if you don't have an emotional hook, if you don't have an image that you have, then it affects your decision making. Now, what this is called is the availability heuristic. So, and it basically means that people assess risk or assess the probability of something based on the visual imagery or the feeling or the associated things that come with it. Problem is, most of our modern risks, we don't have an image that associates with it. So if I don't have that emotional hook, why would I bother taking on board the education and awareness that I only read what I want to read, I only follow what I want to follow, and I only believe what I want to believe in a today's world where you only follow the content you want to follow? So the adage is that very often from our industries, we're the most biased because we see the threat all the time. But the majority of businesses and the majority of the public do not see that. And therefore, they don't follow the education and content because actually it's one of the only crime types that you fall for, which creates a very shaming sort of language, which demotivates people. Because if I say to you, don't fall for that last relationship you had or the last situation you had, well, of course I won't. I wouldn't be so stupid. But actually, in reality, it's still you are actually directed by a crime. So there's a number of factors that come into this.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, do you think that's why mum and dad fraud text messages are so effective, right? Because actually,
100%.
you imagine your children being out with no money or lost their phone and the fear, where you don't really say, oh, I've not received it. You don't have an image of receiving a text message saying, oh, you asked for a one-time PIN message.
100%. Because, somewhat controversially, what's the difference between fraud and marketing? Nothing. There is very, very little difference. Apologies for marketers out there, but there is very little difference because I want to direct your traffic. I want to create, I want to get you to click on a link. I want you to give across information. I want to give across money. I want you to buy a product, whether that product exists or not. But more importantly, emotion gets links clicked. So if you are posting content, etc., you want to create an emotional clickbait for people to come and read your content or buy your product or people being invested. The thing is with fraud and scams, because the intention is really the only difference between fraud and marketing, is that the fact that actually is the emotional context. I will create that emotional imagery in you that your children or your loved ones are in danger, etc., or there's a fear to you, there's a payment that needs to be made, there's a parcel, there's excitement, there's a number of different emotional factors. But criminals are very, very good at creating that initial emotional response. And the problem is that we're not very objective and we don't make particularly good decisions when we are emotional. So, Kevin, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and we found this really hard. So mum and dad fraud text messages started to really happen kind of mid-2024 when it started to get quite publicised. And it was really hard because the fraudsters wanted to hand over to WhatsApp as soon as possible. Yeah. So, and as soon as it's in WhatsApp, we lose complete visibility of any kind of interaction. So we had a task force to say, well, how do we intervene here? But the hardest thing is false positives, because what we don't want to do as well is block genuine messages where someone has dropped their phone down the toilet, for example, or they have smashed it and they need money for a taxi and can you send them? And it's the hardest one to kind of contravene and how do we make sure that we don't actually make anybody vulnerable and actually protect our customers at the same time.
100%.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Paul, and it rings very true when you reference certain examples there. So Kevin, you've kind of mentioned it there with the mum and dad texts, but what are BT doing? So obviously we know that you can kind of put all this prevention content out of there to try and encourage people not to, or be aware of the signs, I guess, maybe. But to Paul's point around the fact that emotions are still involved and humans are still going to be human, what do BT actually do? What are you involved in putting in place to still kind of help to combat when people are victims, or organizations, consumers, the mum and dad text? What is BT's role then?
Yeah, so I think one thing that some people don't appreciate is that the middle companies in the delivery chain of a message. So a bank isn't directly sending that message to BT to other networks to deliver to the subscriber. They have solution providers in the chain. And one of our biggest problems is that we have a wholesale market effectively. So these middlemen work directly with banks, but they also work with other companies that are like them, who also work with banks and work with other international companies. And what we were tending to find is that we were receiving genuine messages and fraudulent messages from the same middlemen company. So we couldn't differentiate, like, well, what's genuine, what's not genuine, because fraudsters are clever, right? They just copy the text message almost word for word. So like, how do we differentiate? So what we're doing now is we're working with banks and delivery companies to like build process. So understand where the message is coming from, and making sure that we have like a single source of truth and a single connection point into our network where we know that genuine messages are coming in, right? And it's quite a large piece of work to do, because banks normally have 6 to 7 different like middlemen companies that they work with. So it's a large piece of work, and there's hundreds of different sort of message templates. So what we're trying to do is create a huge database of message templates, genuine URLs, genuine phone numbers, genuine suppliers, and kind of create process within there, but also have impact as well. So if these partners that connect into our network carry fraudulent messaging, there has to be an impact on that, right? Because they're affecting our subscriber, they're affecting their customer as well. So we're saying if you send fraudulent messaging into our network, there's going to be consequences to that, right? And those consequences can be you're no longer a partner on our network because you're no longer trusted. So we try and manage that wholesale element, but also working closely with the banks to collect this information. And one thing that we always really say is, when you send a message and your bank's name is what we call the sender ID or the alpha tag or whatever you want to call it, like that's as important as your brand logo, and your brand logo that you spend millions of pounds on, and it have very strict rules in terms of how many pixels can be in between that and any kind of text. But what we tend to find is businesses don't treat that sender ID as importantly, and there might be 6 or 7 different variations of that. And the more variations there are, the easier it is for a fraudster to slip into that chain of communication. And the other thing we're also really trying to promote now is business RCS. So this is kind of the evolution of messaging on a mobile network level, which means that you can have a verified sender ID. So if you're the bank and you go through the right verification process, you'll have a blue tick next to your bank name, right? And to kind of, but we need to go through that education process with the customer as well to say this blue tick means something, and it says verified by BT or verified by the other network that maybe that subscriber. So we're saying, come on this journey of a new messaging era that kind of has this additional levels of trust in there. And when you talk about links, instead of links in text messages, it's buttons. And that's something that you talk about SIM farms. You can't introduce a button into a SIM farm. So you start to have more of a brand awareness of what a genuine message looks like. So we're kind of going through that with banks now and taking them on that journey, because it is a technical evolution that needs to happen, but actually it'll be to the benefit of everyone in the future. And I think the really interesting thing is that this has been very much only on a Google handset delivery, but if you look now, like this is evolving across much more handsets in the ecosystem. So other OEMs are coming on board, and hopefully we'll see at the back end of next year maybe 70 to 80% penetration of smartphone devices, which becomes really exciting.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. I actually, in my day job as an account manager within the financial services, I'm definitely involved in multiple conversations about the RCS SMS branding with customers to try and encourage them. And you obviously see some mop-ups and examples as well. And definitely as a consumer on the other side of it, I can definitely vouch that I would be far more likely to click on things if it was to come from a branded organisation. And I think going forward, that will most likely be the future, especially for those vulnerable customers as well. It maybe helps to keep them safe as well.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here, it's not just banks adopting this, right? So actually we're seeing some of the first movers are delivery companies, right? Which is one of the main vectors, because although it doesn't have a direct impact on them, because they're just an intermediary between a brand and the consumer, it has brand impact for them, right? And maybe if you're a delivery company that's highly targeted, one of your customers, whether like a consumer e-commerce, might not want to work with you because of the association of fraud. So it's a very much a wide-ranging approach to fraud and making sure that people's details can't be stolen by messaging.
Yeah, no, that's great, Kevin. Thank you. And I know you mentioned it briefly earlier, but to the point of how BT protects, we've obviously covered organisations and consumers. I guess you were also referencing the fact that your view and BT's view is that consumers, banks, delivery companies, they're all one customer, really, aren't they, in terms of protecting everyone from fraud?
Yeah, it's a holistic approach, right? So what the key thing for us is we want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And doing the right thing is protecting customers. But what you have thousands of businesses. So what we have to do is make sure that we concentrate on the biggest vectors and the most targeted brands, or the biggest risk. So when you consider government, healthcare, delivery, logistics, banking, and even mobile networks as ourselves, right? Like we're probably one of the most targeted, because if you send a message, you know that they sit on a network. If you send a smishing campaign, you've got to take a punt on which bank in a lot of cases to use, and that might not be the bank that they use unless they've harvested data. So we see it as a holistic approach, working with our consumer divisions, with banking, with law enforcement, with the government, to actually create process to protect consumers in the whole.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Kevin. That's very insightful. And then back to you, Paul. How do you personally keep on top of updating trends? Because I know that you've kind of got both lenses, as we've spoke about. So what would you recommend to people listening in terms of how you can keep yourself safe, obviously understanding the way that our minds work?
The problem is with a lot of this is that regardless, the way in which I've manipulated a human being, or I am able to manipulate a human being, hasn't changed forever. But what has changed is very often the format. So again, whether it's be technology, whether it be on devices, etc. Now, the best example I can always come up with is to say, okay, well, regardless of whether it's a postal scam, whether it's a romance fraud, whether it's investment fraud, it's actually like I can't even, I sit both within basically the touch point between law enforcement and lead force on fraud and cybercrime, and UK finance from a financial industry and economic crime point of view, and I sit in between and I see all the different content and the different trends. The problem is, if you actually boil it down, is that they're all the same. So in reality is I need a combination of 5 things. Just like marketing is I need context, I need authority, I need urgency, I need scarcity, and I need emotion. And probably with a massive weight on that last bit around emotion, it spells cause, basically. So I talk about this is that if I want to try and manipulate you, I may want to try and give you a context immediately. I may try to elevate a level of authority, whether I'm from the police, whether it's impersonation, whether I'm from BT, or whatever it may be. But also the urgency element. Why does a car salesman not want you to leave the showroom before you've brought them inside the dotted line? Is because I want to get you to do something within a finite emotional window. The big difference now is that because with faster payments, with a number of these different changes, I can send over my data and or my money within that finite emotional window. The best example as well as I can on top of this is to say, look, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner? Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague? Yes, absolutely. I have 100%. But the emotional context of that text message from the partner is determined whether you had an argument going out the door that morning or a really nice date night the night before. We forget that every single piece of information that we see, whether it's on social media, whether it's an SMS text message, whether it's WhatsApp, You're in a familiar territory because you're on your own device. You're normally in a safe environment as well, but you're only got your emotional projection in this space. So the fact is that the idea that it's too good to be true is rubbish. Nobody can tell me what too good is. And this whole idea of trusting your gut is generally terrible advice because the fact is your intuition is, in a lot of cases, is designed to make you comfortable. Now, in a real life environment, or again, not through tech, generally speaking, I would say 100% trust your gut. You've got a lot more to go on. You've got a lot of kind of facial and different elements and stimuli to be able to tell it. The problem is, like that text message from a partner, you are projecting the way you feel, the way they feel, the emotional context of your relationship onto that text message is basically asking you what for dinner. So the best example I can give is to say, well, yes, you've got context, authority, urgency, scarcity, emotion, but it's emotional mindfulness. It is fundamentally our security, because of the way technology has changed, our security is fundamental to the way we feel. Look at disinformation, look at politics now, look at a lot of these sorts of things. We are able to read what we want to read, and whatever your behavior is online essentially gets normalized because you only seek out what you want to seek out. So you have a situation here where actually I can give you all of the education in the world. I can give you all of the top 10 tips, but to expect a member of the public who doesn't necessarily care about and don't believe that they would fall for it, then why would they follow the campaign? Why would they follow the education? Why would they read the email from the organization that's trying to protect them if I don't think I'd ever be that stupid?
Yeah.
And it's about changing the language. It's about changing the language we perceive, because in fact, it's not that you fall for it. It's that you were directly or indirectly targeted by a criminal who wanted to steal your money or your data. That's the reality of the situation. So it's about changing the language. It's about understanding that actually the prerequisite for you to be vulnerable to manipulation is that you're human and breathing. And understanding that is very often taking that point, because as soon as I get that text message, you may be distracted. There may be other contexts. You might be going through a tough time. You might be excited. All these different emotions. Is I can give you all the education, but I cannot make you any less emotional in the moment. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this kind of counter education is very often, yes, you've got stop, think, fraud from the Home Office campaign, etc., and a national campaign around account fraud. It's fundamentally about stopping, taking that moment. And that's actually the main core of the advice that we can give.
I think to add to that as well is maybe we want to encourage, if you're listening, great, but maybe try and share this podcast and some of Paul's other content to raise the whole awareness around the fact that people that are choosing not to listen to these podcasts or are not aware of them are actually the ones that are maybe becoming more susceptible off the back of that, because like you say, they're choosing to not expose themselves.
Well, even in information security for businesses as well, I've done a lot of work around that aspect. And the biggest issue for security professionals and IT professionals is to motivate their business or motivate their staff and colleagues to take the information security and the education seriously. The problem is most of that's through e-learning. Most of that's through completely faceless spreadsheet tick box exercises and all these sorts of things. But we're remembering that when we are educating and when we are making those messages, remembering that we are really incredibly biased because we see the threat. We are interested and invested to see the threat all the time. But the problem is the public aren't. And your staff and colleagues aren't necessarily, unless they do the job that you do. So it's a number of these different factors that actually is like, you know what, your crime prevention role is essentially marketing. So
yeah, it's an interesting angle for sure. Great, really interesting, and as I say, it's a different lens completely for me to understand it from, so I'm sure the listeners will find it as interesting as I have. So before we wrap up then, thank you both so much for your time. It's been really interesting, and hopefully everyone listening will take away some key learnings from this as well. If you haven't already, please do take a listen to the last podcast as well. It's obviously not more specific as this one, but it does help to contextualise the whole fraud landscape. I think we can definitely agree that some of the key themes will be consistent across the episode. So again, to Kevin's point of taking a holistic approach across the industry is best to understand fraud and how it will impact multiple organisations, consumers, family members, friends. And I think also that knowledge shared across the industry is just absolutely key to beat the fraudsters, and showing that different organisations and partners are joined together, such as ourselves on calls like this today. Every little will help a step closer towards raising that awareness and helping to prevent fraud. I would also like to call out, in terms of the FinTech Scotland frill, we do also have an update on that the application process has commenced and is now closed. And we did receive a fantastic response of applications through to the programme. And I believe that have been successfully sifted down to the final few. So we do encourage our audience to keep your eyes and ears peeled for further details on the innovations that will be joining us as part of the programme. We'll definitely give you an update on the next episode as well, which will be coming to you in February. So that's all from me. And Kevin and Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And we'll look forward to speaking to you all soon. Thank you.
A huge thank you to our guests, Kevin and Paul, for sharing your insight, and to Charlotte for leading a great conversation. Thank you. So today's discussion highlighted the behavioral science behind why scams work and the innovative steps taken by BT and industry partners. I think it also showed the importance of collaboration in staying ahead of fraudsters. So don't forget to read more about our research and innovation programs on the topic. It's all on our website. You've got white papers, you've got blogs, and podcast episodes. So thank you to our listeners, and for our growing base of subscribers. We'll see you next time.